Thanks for joining as well. I really enjoyed reading this book. It's a very rich book. There's lots that it covers, and there's lots that I'd like to discuss today. So let's see how we get on with the time we have. The first thing that I'd like to ask, maybe just as a way of giving people in the audience who haven't read the book yet a bit of an introduction to the main idea, is if you could just introduce us to this concept of the free gift. So what is the free gift of nature? And why do you think it can illuminate capitalism and how capitalism treats nature?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me and for joining this conversation. I mean, I've learned a lot from your work, Andrés, and so I'm excited to be speaking with you in particular. But also it's just great to be here. So, the free gift of nature is not a term that I came up with myself. It's a term that I get from both classical political economy and then Marx's critique of classical political economy. So the free gift, if you read sort of an older generation of classical political economists, people like Ricardo and Jean-Baptiste and these types of thinkers, they often talk about the gratuitous contributions that nature makes to production and the gifts of these natural agents to production, and they're sort of celebrating the various elements of the non-human world, from like sheep organs to wind that blows merchant ships to soil that's part of the contributions to, if they're trying to analyze the economy and production, then they see all the ways that nature contributes and does so gratuitously. And Marx is critical of this, as he is of many things that the classical political economists say. And, he says they don't understand that nature's free gifts gives to capital alone, and that, in a system where one group of people own the means of production, that is sort of, captured, that those people capture the sort of gifts of nature themselves. But it's not really a very developed concept. There's a sort of brief reference to it in Marx and a few other places where Marx references the free gifts of nature. But it's not something that he sort of goes on about at length. And I came to think it was actually a pretty interesting and strange category, and one that is important for thinking about, what exactly, how we should think about nature and capitalism. Because it is quite strange. Like, a free gift should be either a contradiction or redundancy, that like gifts are not, they're not something you buy and sell, so they are kind of free by default on the one hand. On the other hand, they often thought it was something that's fundamentally reciprocal and that you have to return. And I think, what I argue is that the free gift is this, it is a peculiar phrase. It designates the quality that natural agents take on within a capitalist society in particular, that it's only in a capitalist society that a free gift would sort of become a plausible concept, when other things are sort of bought and sold, when in a world of generalized commodity exchange, where that's how you sort of acquire and exchange and interact with most things, it becomes notable that the gifts of nature are free. And so I argue that the free gift of nature is a capitalist social form. It's sort of equivalent to something like the commodity, and describing this sort of category of things that have, use value, but not exchange, and that don't contribute to value in the Marxist sense of the term, but that are nevertheless significant in production, that are significant in sort of both in sort of classical forms of production, but also in sort of remaking the world in which capitalism exists, and that they are, we have to attend to this whole world of things that are often described as sort of like mere use values by Marx and others, and that these actually have more significance than we've often thought within in understanding like how capitalism treats nature, but actually that there are a lot of implications for other aspects of how we understand what capitalism does and what it doesn't do, for understanding the limits to commodification and capitalization, to understand the places where, rather than absorbing everything into its orbit, capital sometimes, just like leaves things out, neglects things, abdicates them. So I try to show how the free gift of nature is a concept that helps us understand a lot of later formulations of and conceptualizations of climate and environmental politics, and the problems that we see in contemporary environmental politics, but also that I think it can really shift our perspective on how and where capitalism is located and operating.
Right. Thanks so much. That's really helpful to give us a way into thinking about the free gift. I mean, one of the things I really like about how you approach this category, and you mentioned it just briefly there, is the way in which we push back against something like a truism held by many critics of capitalism, which is that capitalism is a system which will just tendentially absorb and internalize everything that it encounters. And so the general tendency of capitalism is to commodify everything. And you use the free gift as a way of complicating that account, I think, and showing that actually there's some things that capital doesn't commodify. And this raises this very interesting question of why. And you talk about abandonment or abdication of these things, which are then rendered free gifts of nature. So they're not owned by anyone, they're not bought and sold, they're just freely exploitable by anyone. And generally the benefits of that exploitation accrue to capital. So can you tell us a bit more about why it is that capital is not interested in commodifying these things, or does not, in effect, end up commodifying them?
Yeah. So I make an argument to begin with that tries to describe how and why I think the free gift is constituted as sort of a basic social relation, and how the treatment, the moment when human labor is something that's sold for wage, and like the sort of centrality of human wage labor, and human labor becomes human wage labor, and sort of constitutes non-human nature by default as a particularly non-wage entity, and that there's this division that capitalism draws in general. And this is part of why I think the nature becomes a free gift by default relative to human labor, which has to be sort of bought and sold. But of course, there are many elements of nature that are commodified, that are purchased, and so property becomes sort of an important piece of how and why that happens. And sort of the things that can be owned. There you can charge rents for elements of nature that are owned. People, the owner of the land, or the sheep, or whatever, can sort of represent it in the market to some degree, which I still say is, I think, an important distinction between representing oneself and representing someone or something that you own. But in any case, there are huge amounts of the non-human world that just never that are very difficult to sort of bring into that into forms of property that can allow them to be represented in market exchange and commodity exchange in that way. So I look in one chapter in particular at the many kinds of non-human nature that basically seem to perpetually resist property relations, and in turn commodification, and sort of becoming like even able to bear rents. And so and it turns out that this is, I think, quite a large chunk of the world. Like, actually, if you think about, like, we have this narrative again that nature is, capitalism perpetually commodifies things, that nature will eventually be, like, the critique of a lot of ecological critiques of capitalism say that capitalism will slowly bring in all of the non-human world. It'll put a price on all of nature. It'll commodify, every last sort of carbon molecule and things like that. But when you look at it, that just doesn't happen. And I think, again, it's because of these forms of these many forms of nature. And one of the things the book tries to do is look at, like, the what we think of again as sort of the physical side, the use values, the concreteness of these sorts of different kinds of natures, and to understand those as being significant, that we can't just look at sort of like the form of the commodity, but we need to look at this pairing of what Marx describes as social and natural form, the sort of dual nature of capitalist social forms, which are, kind of an abstract and a concrete always paired. And so I try to really follow through, like, well, what's happening with the concrete that informs whether and how things appear in particular abstract forms. And so, I do look at all of these kinds of whether it's global carbon cycles, or, ecological processes that are very difficult to sort of separate out, own, and sort of allocate as something that can be bought and sold and turned into these sources of value generation, as spaces that, like, they're not going to become profitable. Capital has no interest in investing them. It abdicates them. But that this is actually, like, a big problem, right? So it's not just being commodified that's the problem. It's also being kind of left outside of the orbit of capital, because that means often just being that these things that aren't that aren't absorbed are neglected. They're converted into other kinds of commodity producing natures. They're kind of left to erode. They're sort of left to um, to deteriorate through neglect and abandonment, and that's sort of a dimension of the problem that we haven't looked at closely enough.
Mm. I think that comes out really well in your discussion of this idea of the cost disease. So, whereas the relative cost of manufactured goods is always decreasing, or at least in many sectors is decreasing, and so we're able to access material things relatively, at an ever cheaper rate. The cost of these natural processes, or processes, even forms of labor, which are much more difficult to automate, to organize in an industrial way, to accelerate, their relative cost is always increasing, and at a certain point it's just not profitable, and so it's not desirable for capital to invest in those, and so they are then jettisoned or abandoned by capital and become really difficult for people to access. I wonder if you think that will always be a part of the way that capitalism works, or whether it's just a kind of practical constraint. I mean, you can think about something like care work, which is maybe one of those sectors that has always been traditionally very difficult to automate, or very difficult to cheapen through the introduction of technological efficiency and so on and so forth. There might be a new wave of technologies, AI supported technologies, that start to make something like care work cheaper or more efficient or something like that. So are these abandoned zones abandoned just because of these practical constraints, or do you think there's something more systematic or structural about the fact that they have to be left outside?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and just for context, I guess. So part of the book is just looking at these different versions of the free gift, and again, how the sort of like concrete elements of these different kinds of natures, for lack of a better term, are relevant within labor processes, production processes, and so on. And so there are, many, including reproductive labor, that I think are sort of that we end up seeing abdicated, and divergences from industrial production as sort of like the Ur model. Do I think that those are all? I guess I would say I don't think there's anything inherent in any of these particular forms of labor or nature. And one of the things I actually want to do in the book is to get away from the idea that there's like a distinctive thing called something like reproductive labor or care work, that is like a kind of transhistorical category, or like a type of labor that is different from other kinds. I think it's what's different about it, again, are these sort of qualitative dimensions, these sort of elements of the concrete labor process that are yeah, simply more difficult to make productive, to make efficient, to industrialize, and to sort of make produce a return, than the more classically industrial forms of production. And so in some ways it's a corrective to, I think, some versions of arguments about reproductive labor that want to say there's something like inherent in reproductive labor, that's either sometimes it's treated as like morally virtuous in a way, that's that somehow that capitalism has to have it be free. I think we should just treat these things as more on a continuum. There are a lot of kinds of labor that are necessary for human life, and that the distinction even between what ends up being reproductive and productive is actually mostly like a sort of an outgrowth of how capital has organized human labor. So I do think that things like care bots, or something, it's possible to imagine them coming in and transforming aspects of reproductive work, or what we think of as reproductive work. What I think, one of the questions that I think comes in there that's interesting in thinking about the political dimensions, is that, a lot of what the economist William Baumol talks about, like as personal services and these kinds of things that are very difficult to make productive in the manner of industrial work. It's not that you necessarily can't increase productivity, but it comes to it often like quite significant cost of the quality of the product. So, if you have like one teacher teaching 10 students versus teaching 50 students, there's going to be a significant decline in the product quality. And I would imagine something similar would happen if you introduce care bots. I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll come up with really amazing AI chatbots who are better than the bored human assistant. Who knows? But that A, there would be sort of a sense of there would potentially be quality decline, and that then the sort of question comes in is a kind of political subjective one, which is like what level of quality of goods and services will people accept, or be forced to accept, have to kind of make do with. And so there's a set of sort of questions that I think arise around that. But then also, there I think will still be, I think there are going to be elements that are sort of perpetually resistant for some time, just when we're thinking about, again, like sort of physical aspects of human reproduction. And I try to really focus on human reproduction as something where, like, what's important in the physicality is the body of the person being reproduced and cared for, rather than the body of the reproducer, as in some more kind of classical gender essentialist feminist arguments. But I think some of those are going to remain, at least like recalcitrant to productivity gains. And again, I think when we're looking at this kind of trying to attend to the concrete aspect of the pairing of social and natural form, there's nothing that's going to be, I would say there's nothing that is inherently cannot be remade. But we can see a lot of places where some things have very persistently been very difficult to put onto the sort of like capitalist temporal cycles, and to like bring into the abstract time that capital like generally institutes and requires. So nothing is sort of impossible. Similarly, if we think about like carbon cycles, you could have carbon removal machines that would sort of suck carbon out of the air, that would be automated in a sense. I think it would still be very difficult for other reasons to kind of make into a site of profit generation that I won't go into here. But there's nothing that I would say is just like impossible. But that we need to attend to these things nevertheless if we want to understand actually existing capitalism in a physically in an actually existing material world.
One of the other critiques that you present that I think is really strong, because in a way it engages with something that is pervasive amongst many different bodies of literature, from kind of ecological Marxism through to environmental ethics and ecofeminism, is the critique of what you call the worldview approach to the exploitation of nature, which is essentially the idea that the condition of possibility for the exploitation of nature is to depict or represent nature as something that has no value and is just completely exploitable and is at our disposal for its instrumental use. And it's this depiction or this representation which enables that exploitation to take place, and then by extension, those things which are characterized as natural or nature-like or naturalized can similarly be exploited. So women or colonized people, animals, the land, etc., etc. And that's a position which we find across many, many different authors, I think, and many different literatures. So I found this critique really interesting. Maybe you can tell us just a little bit more about what you see as this worldview approach, and then what the alternative explanation that you put forward to the exploitation of nature is.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, I think one of the dominant ways of explaining, why people ask often, of course, like why do we treat nature so badly in modern capitalist industrialized society? People have different kind of ways of understanding what sort of modern the nature of modern life, but why do we why are we seeing these forms of ecological degradation and destruction and so on? And I have found that very often the answer rests on some version of this idea that like we just have the wrong sort of perspective or view of what nature is, that we've come to see nature in the wrong way. There's a real emphasis on images of nature, on kind of culturally produced sort of understandings of nature. There's a huge literature in like environmental studies and kind of critical nature studies that's about showing all the ways that nature as a concept is sort of culturally constructed, and like these different sort of social constructions of what nature is, and that emphasize the ways that whether it's like Francis Bacon saying nature is kind of a bring this mechanistic view of nature as something that you kind of can like take apart and put back together again and re-engineer, or Descartes kind of drawing the distinction between the sort of like thinking human and like the animal is machine or things like that. There's like a lot of accounts that are basically rooted in some version of, well, there were this new set of ideas came in and they transformed how we all thought about nature, and Cartesian dualism has kind of made us all like fail to recognize that the natural world is should be treated differently or better, and that sort of destroyed our harmonious relationship. And I have to say, I have come to find these not very convincing, because I think they do basically just put far too much weight on something like we might think of as ideology, and kind of an ideology critique that says, well, if we show how and why this this like has if we sort of changed our vision of the world, if we sort of came to see nature in the right way, maybe we would like treat it better. We need to, it's got the suggestion that we just need to change our attitudes, basically. And I find that implausible. And, a lot of things about kind of the story about how these ideologies sort of permeate, it tends to be very vague, very loose. They don't seem to explain like how and why. Often they sort of root things in like Western culture, which doesn't do much to explain how and why non-Western societies also seem to sort of, generate these relationships in nature as they kind of move into like capitalist industrialization and so on. So, I've found those to be like lacking in explanatory power, and also kind of an account of what plausibly might, undo or change these. They tend to be very voluntarist in the vision of like, remaking our attitudes. So what I try to argue for is like that this is, we need to think about how, basically how, capitalism compels us to treat non-human nature, like whether or not we think it should, regardless of our attitudes, in this kind of unconscious way. Like I can think it's really horrible that we treat nature as a free gift, and that we should, replenish and return nature's gifts and have a reciprocal relationship and have like a very different orientation towards the more than human world, and have a really different perspective on it. But it doesn't matter, because so much of what I'm doing in the world is actually, most of the ways I'm interacting with the non-human world in my daily life is actually by like engaging in relationships of exchange, like commodity exchange. I'm like going out and buying like a book or something, and that's buying eventually these trees that have been converted into paper into the book. I'm eating my sandwich. I'm all of these things that we're doing on a daily basis are forms are really how most of us relate to non-human nature most of the time. And I think that the free gift is sort of embedded in those interactions by default, whether or not like we're conscious of it, whether or not we wish we were doing something differently, however, however much we're trying to sort of, live consciously or sustainably, or whatever it may be. So this is why I think we really need to like look at the fundamental social relations of capitalism and try to dig into that question of like the social form and what constitutes sort of relationships amongst human beings within capitalist societies, and how nature, the sort of status of nature, changes in relation to the relationships amongst human beings in capitalism. Because it is a system where we're mostly, again, like acting through various forms of compulsion, rather than just sort of going around and consciously choosing how to relate to one another or to elements of the more than human world. So that's where I want to orient our attention, and get away from this idea that we just need to kind of like have like, think more rightly or be more enlightened with respect to our view of the non-human world.
Mm. Yeah, I found that aspect of the argument really compelling, and I think it opens the way for a more materialist analysis of the exploitation of nature, which is very distinct from the path of saying we just need to have the right ideas about nature, and then we'll be able to resolve these problems. I think this focus on compulsion also links to what is really the kind of philosophical foundation. Along with Marx's critique of political economy, I think the philosophical foundation of the book, which is the way you draw on existentialism, and contrast the vision of freedom we get in existentialism to the market compulsion, which is characteristic of capitalism. So maybe you could say something about how you draw on the work of Sartre and Beauvoir.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good way of putting out the sort of critique of political economy plus existentialism. And yeah, I argue in the book for a critique of capitalism that's rooted not in just the sort of charge that capitalism destroys nature, which I think is sort of the implicit argument of a lot of eco-Marxism. And, I'm certainly far from the first to have a kind of ecological critique of capitalism. But I do think they tend to be rooted in this idea that like capitalism just is destructive of the non-human world. And that's sort of, that's it. But I think that is a fairly difficult argument to square with, a sort of critical perspective on nature and what nature is and whether there is some kind of ecological baseline against which we can measure things, whether there is sort of a stable like nature that is the goal to be reached rather than the sort of set of relationships that are perpetually in flux, both kind of like amongst non-human entities, but also between non-human nature and human societies. It's hard to know sort of what does it mean to destroy nature rather than to transform it, change it, to live again in these sorts of mutually reconstituting ways that we know human societies have always lived with non-humans. But I also think it tends to, the book is also informed by kind of like a generally, I guess, like feminist sensibility that that we shouldn't appeals to nature, just not liberatory. We should not set nature as sort of the standard against which we want to measure social orders and sort of whether a society is good or bad, and to say, well, it's deviating from sort of what the natural path is to me a not very convincing argument. So I want to say we do need to make a lot of decisions about how to relate to the more than human world to decide, is this, do we think it's good, the things that we're sort of, the ways that we're living with non-humans, the things that we're doing to ecosystems, the ways that those sorts of effects on ecosystems are repercussing back into human communities, whether in the form of like toxic waste or, polluted water or the absence of forms of other forms of life that, like species extinction or insect decline or whatever it may be, that we need to assess these things, but that I want to kind of do so in a slightly anti-foundationalist way, or to say this is about decisions we have to make about the world we're remaking and want to live in. And I find existentialism a useful resource in that regard, because it is very insistent that, values are not given by God or nature. They're what we sort of make for ourselves and choose for ourselves, and then have to enact in the world and take responsibility for the choices we're making. And I think it's a counterintuitive, certainly, position for a kind of book about nature, because I think it's possibly, as such says, existentialism is a humanism. It's seen as this, like, I think, very anthropocentric and kind of potentially like like human domination oriented in some way. I do think it's anthropocentric, but I think that's what we have to just kind of like live, like, accept in some way, that a lot of what we're going to be doing, that we value is, in my view, a human concept, that the ways that we're going to make these decisions are going to be made by us as human beings. We have to kind of just take responsibility for that, rather than saying, well, this is about intrinsic value and kind of offloading a bunch of the questions we have to make onto some other site. And I don't think it has to be about only valuing human goals or ends. I think that we can absolutely make sort of existentialist choices to value, treat the non-human world differently and better, and kind of to have a very different orientation towards the more than human world. It doesn't have to be, again, like just oriented towards sort of human interests alone, as it might be. But I do think it gives us a sort of perspective on, sort of a perspective that's like critical of some of the kind of naturophilia that I think is very pervasive, and the kind of idea of nature as like a moral standard that's quite pervasive in environmental ethics and thought, and that I want to move away from, and gives us a sense of like a multiple dimensions of value to set against like the singular form of value that we're sort of pushed into by capitalism, but that offers a sort of a range, a multi-dimensional sense of value.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. And I think it comes back towards the end of the book where you start to develop your kind of positive proposals in a really neat way. And I want to ask you more about that. But just before we get to that, I want to just ask one question about your discussion of social costs, which I think is really
Mhm.
interesting. And I learned a lot from that section of the book where you talk about Ronald Coase. You set up a really helpful opposition there, I think, between Coase's position, which is this kind of extreme kind of market libertarianism, all of the problems to do with the allocation of natural resources and that even things like pollution and toxic waste can be resolved through kind of market relations and exchange between private individuals. And then on the other hand, the moral philosophers of nature who want to talk about the ways in which there are certain things which should not be up for sale. So there are these noxious markets, and I think you have a really convincing dialectical critique of both of these positions. So can you tell us a bit more about Coase's idea of the social cost?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a chapter where I'm trying to think about the social costs and sort of pollution as like the underbelly of the free gift and the sort of, dark side of the free gift. It's free things that they're like bad. They're not nice gifts. Um, and look at the dominant theories of the externality, and Coase's theory of social costs is one of them, and that's really trying to orient or ends up anchoring, this turn towards like law and economy and kind of a very market oriented, what people often describe as like a neoliberal approach to political economy and law. And he says basically, that the things we describe as social costs are, we have to be kind of more neutral in our understanding. So when a factory causes pollution, we shouldn't just say like the factory is imposing a social cost on the people who live nearby. Rather the factory is like emitting pollution, but people are choosing to live near the factory. It's kind of unclear. They're both causing the problem, is what he says. That these people have chosen to live in the path of the factory just as much as the factory has chosen to pump out noxious chemicals. So the way to sort this out isn't for the state to say, well, we're going to tax the pollution and say you shouldn't pollute. It's like he's like, that's who are we to say? What we should do is just assign like a property right in the pollution, and then like have them, kind of like just basically bargain it out, and that will, you'll sort of buy or sell the right to pollute, and that will kind of end up being, like whatever that is worth to different parties will sort of settle the matter. Um, and, this is always very, people are very critical of Coase for this, kind of extreme, like apply the market to everything, including rights and law and things like that. And I'm sympathetic to that, but I do find Coase to be quite interesting because one of the things he says is that, he describes this reciprocal relationship, which I think we could reconceptualize in terms of it is sort of a relationship of struggle. It's like, who is going to bear the cost? Like if we sort of think of it as not as he recognizes that there are these two parties who are involved, and that they are in conflict and they do have divergent interests, and that there is something. He describes pollution as a factor of production. That pollution, and I think there's something to that, right? That pollution is something that is being generated in the course of commodity production, that we usually just ignore, just let be kind of it sort of happens. It's just the default is that it just dumps out into the world, and people don't often have to pay for it, or you have to institute regulations to make them do so. But so there are these elements that I think he actually does perceive rightly, and that if you sort of take a different angle on it, you take a more Marxist perspective, we can think of these not just as like, oh, this is bad because the market has encroached on, again, things that it shouldn't be dealing in, like pollution, but actually this is just sort of like more like many other forms of like dimensions of power and domination under capitalism than we might initially recognize. So we can think about the ways that the the power that the capitalist has over what to produce and how, also means power over what kinds of byproducts and toxins and pollution and things like that to produce, the ways that it's relatively easy to impose those on people who don't have much much else to like. I mean, in this case, they're not able to sort of sell their labor power in the same way, but the ways that class makes it possible to impose those sorts of physical elements on others, and that we should actually sort of take something from the kind of Coasean analysis and like put it again into like a more class struggle register that can recognize this as consistent with other aspects of capitalism, rather than sort of this aberration or this like weird problem that pollution is should either be treated as totally separate and like a moral question, or there's something wrong with treating it as continuous with other kinds of priced goods.
Great. So just before we move on to taking some questions from the audience, I want to ask you about some of the positive proposals that you developed towards the end of the book. So you start to talk about how we might approach some of these questions differently, and I think you start to carve out a very interesting and quite distinctive position. So one of the things you talk about is the socialization of nature, and that seems to be quite important to what you propose. And the question which is opened up by the critique that's developed throughout the book is really about the possibility of alternative frameworks of valuation and practices of planning and management of the economy of our collective lives. So maybe you can say something about how you're seeing all of this come together on the basis of the critiques that you develop in the book.
Yeah, definitely. I'll say, first of all, it's really not a very programmatic book. I'm afraid it doesn't have much in the way of like, what should we do about climate change? Although I think, often people sort of want to know what that would be. But I do try to gesture in some directions, both in terms of kinds of political projects that I think might have potential or kind of be places to start to see, a politics of nature under capitalism developing, but also in some kind of more concrete ways. And this idea of socializing nature and what I talk about as conscious planet making are one of them. And this comes out of this chapter that, is about efforts to sort of impose, put prices on ecosystems to sort of bring ecosystems into market exchange, to make ecosystems into new forms of assets and, potential source of value generation, and the sort of repeated failure of these. In keeping with the previous sort of what we were talking about earlier, the kinds of nature that actually become very difficult to render in forms of private property and to sort of to bring into capital's orbit. There's been a huge amount of effort expended in trying to make things into carbon credits or put prices, construct markets and ecosystem services and all of these things. And they, I think they failed and will continue to fail, but we keep seeing waves and waves of it. And so one of the things I'm sort of saying is actually, there is something, ecosystems are almost sort of already socialized because these physical qualities do tend to resist the relations of private ownership. And they're also kind of automated in a sense. They mostly work on their own. Like you can do some restoration here or there, some maintenance, but then they kind of are producing these services and functions in their own right. And so what I would like to see, rather than sort of these constant visions of how do you privatize ecosystem services and that's the way to save them, it seems much more straightforward to sort of treat them as these socialized entities that in some senses they kind of practically are, but then also to sort of extend from that and say, well, what would that mean? It would mean, and I draw on some work by the philosopher Jacob Blumenfeld here too, but to see them as, sort of genuinely these sites of what he describes as political contest and coordinated planning, sort of ask these non-monetary questions about what the value of ecosystems are, which are very live in a lot of the debates over ecosystem services. It's like, what functions are they providing? What are their physical uses? What kinds of, whether it's energetic flows or sort of, circulation of nutrients and minerals or whatever it may be. There are a lot of we can attend to these different kinds of questions around what ecosystems are doing, what kind of work they're doing for who, what kinds of purposes they serve in our societies, and think about those through a register other than cost and sort of profitability. And that if we did that, we would not only sort of be looking at kind of existing ecosystems, we'd have to recognize that these things are also kind of that when we think about how and why we are preserving any given ecosystem or restoring or something, we'll also have to start rethinking elements of like the private organization of production, like how commodity production encroaches on, the Indonesian jungle, or the Amazonian rainforest, or, the Louisiana marshland, or whatever it may be, and start to reevaluate some of those things. Like, do we want to be converting, the marsh into a set of, like oil pipelines or something like that. So it's about really trying to recognize, like, we already have remade the planet. Like, there's not just, again, like a kind of nature to go back to. We're not just going to sort of like leave it alone entirely. That's really not an option for us at this point in history. We're going to have to kind of like be remaking the planet, but rather than doing it as capitalism does, which is through this sort of anarchic, chaotic, but like always oriented towards value production as sort of the only objective, that we would start to say, like, what other kinds of values, objectives do we have, and how might we order our relationships to one another and to the non-human world in such a way as to achieve them. So that's what I want us to point towards, and I think there are a lot of more concrete ways to think about how that might be instantiated.
Great. And just one final question I want to ask before we move to some of the questions that we have from the audience now. It's about the conception of freedom, really, which underlies your vision of a post-capitalist future. And this is, I think, a very active question and issue amongst many of the current discussions around post-capitalist futures. And it's really the question of whether human freedom is dependent on some kind of mastery and exploitation of nature. And my own view is that I think Marx is quite ambiguous, or has a kind of ambivalence towards this. We find quite different statements in his work about this issue. And you deal with it right at the end of the book in a very interesting way. And it's really this issue of whether resource constraints are constraints on human freedom, or there might be a way to live out human freedom within a resource constrained environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you that I think Marx is ambiguous on this point, and in this, both on this question and more in generally, I think one of the things I try to do is avoid some of the I try to engage with Marx pretty seriously, but to avoid some of the weeds of Marxology and like, what did Marx really say or mean? Because often there are kind of points in both directions, and in any case, it seems less important to me than like trying to draw on his method and think through problems. But in this, the main thing I wanted to take up in this ending chapter is what seems to be a real anxiety amongst many contemporary ecological thinkers, that the end of kind of like rampant resource use will mean the end of what we know as modern human freedom. And you see this in people like Dipesh Chakrabarty, probably most famously, who says, like, asks if the mansion of modern freedoms rests on fossil fuel use. And more generally, the idea that like we have used all of these non-human like gifts of nature to replace human labor and make life, kind of overcome forms of, what Marx might talk about as necessity. And that there is this longer tradition, obviously, of kind of the idea that realm of freedom lies beyond the realm of necessity. And only once you've conquered necessity can you kind of truly live freely. And most of what I want to do in the chapter is to kind of, or on the one hand, one of the things I want to do is to really question that idea and where it's taken us, because the idea that you only kind of can be free once necessity is totally conquered. And I think there's actually more ambiguity in Marx himself on this point, but the way it's often been taken up is again, you have to sort of totally conquer the realm of like natural necessity and sort of dominate nature in some sense in order to be free, and that you have to either substitute your labor with someone else's, or substitute it with fossil fuels or with machines, to be free of labor, to be able to sort of, do things that are good in themselves. And this seems to me to end up being a fairly tragic view of freedom often. Sometimes it ends up like being converted into the idea of like freedom from all scarcity is the only way to live freely. I think that kind of is where we end up with something like the fully automated luxury communism vision where freedom relies on mining asteroids. And if you can't mine asteroids, then like maybe human freedom is sort of foreclosed. And that just seems like absurd to me. And actually quite tragic about freedom, that there's, and pessimistic about freedom, that there's like freedom is fully kind of like a function of resource use, and that just seems to not describe what freedom actually is to me at all. So that, yeah, this is a place where I try to draw instead on Beauvoir in particular, who I think whose work I really like, because she has, she talks about ambiguous freedom and sort of this situated freedom that is, I think, you know, has elements of the broader, existentialist project of like choosing sort of one's values and enacting them in the world, and sort of being responsible for what one chooses, and things that I think are quite important, but also is very attentive to embodiment and sort of the physicality of these things in a way that I think Sartre isn't always, and that I think is quite useful in thinking through some of these questions of how do you navigate choices in a material world. How do you think about these sort of formal aspects of, thinking about what are our values, or what are our sort of, kind of, how to think about constraints on our action as not only sort of formal social relations, but also things that matter, in a very material, physical sense. And she can, I think, hold together against some of these poles of like abstract and concrete, or sort of formal and forming content, and trying to like chart some way of like how do you have a freedom that's like neither purely formal, purely social, nor just like so embedded in the material that it ends up becoming reduced to material features. And to think about like the choices that we make, again, about how to reorganize our lives, including our material lives, are real ones or live ones, or perpetually open ones, and they're ones that we have to make like over and over again. And that, to me, seeming like a more useful way of thinking about like what freedom will look like in a world that will have resource constraints, that will be also changing in ways that we can't predict or control, and that like an important element of freedom will be recognizing that we will kind of have to continue to reorient ourselves towards that, and reorganize ourselves, and make decisions about how to live in this changing world over and over again. So that's where I try to go with it a bit.
Great. So I think we should now turn to the questions we have from the audience. If you are tuned in, do feel free to keep adding your questions via the Q&A box. So the first question is from Joshua, who says, do you think movements like the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Rivers offers an alternative or hope to the current economic system?
Yeah, this is a great question. I talk a bit about the rights of nature in actually the chapter on social costs, because one of the things I find very interesting about the rights of nature is that it, like the sort of classic paper on, like the initial paper on the rights of nature, should trees have standing, emerges in part as an answer to the problem of social cost, where Christopher Stone, the legal theorist who's writing it, is trying to address precisely this problem that I described with, Ronald Coase, and the problem of like dumping pollution, and the problem of sort of collective action problems that arise from situations where a lot of people are kind of affected by a small amount of pollution, but it's very difficult for them to challenge the producer of the pollution. And he says, well, like, if you have a lot of people who live around a lake and the lake is being polluted, it's probably not going to be worth it to anyone who lives around the lake to bring a charge against the factory owner. But if they could all get together, then maybe it would be. And so what if the lake were the bearer of like the right to challenge the lake could be kind of the aggregate body that brings together these different, people who live around the lake, and it could sort of, unify them in a sense. And then like, what if we actually paid attention to the things that go on with the lake, and the non-humans that, are kind of the non-human interesting questions that are not represented economically or legally, and kind of extends it from there. But I think that's really interesting as a way of thinking about the rights of nature, not as they're often discussed, which is usually as kind of like a recognition of the intrinsic value of certain like ecosystemic features, or like a river has like intrinsic value that should be recognized in law, and also that tends to be, I think, like sometimes symbolically important, but often difficult to give teeth to. It's like a declaration that it's sometimes unclear to me whether or how that will like be mobilized in the world, or what force it will have against something like a developer who wants to, I don't know, dam up the river or something like that. but as rather a way of constituting this form of like potential social power and saying like this is a way to kind of potentially provide a vehicle for collective action against again that kind of reciprocal struggle between like the mill owner who wants to dump the the waste in the lake and the sort of its inhabitants who want that not to happen, and that it might kind of go as like a little bit more political thrust and sort of sense of again like social collective action to put behind the rights of nature as opposed to just like affirming rights in some formal sense, but having very little in the way of a social force to enact it. So I think it has potential, but I would like to think about how it can be a more forceful category, I guess.
So the next question is from George, who says, ecological economics is the bourgeois economist effort to correctly price nature, which would otherwise be free. Do you consider this a fruitful approach? And if not, why not?
Do I find ecological economics a fruitful approach?
Yeah, the attempt to price
I
nature.
guess so. Yeah. I talk about the attempts of price nature a lot in this one chapter on ecosystem services, and I I I agree. I actually think that the ecological economists remind me of someone like the physiocrats, in the sense of like value comes from nature. But find it I find it fruitful, if not correct in some sense. I do think a lot of these efforts are sort of often futile and misguided in various ways, but I also think they've been useful in a couple of senses. One is in the kind of just like um, the debates themselves, I think, are often quite interesting in terms of again raising these questions of like what are the different things that ecosystems do? What values are they do they have to society? They sort of, even though they're trying to calculate a price, they kind of take us into price and say like what are actually what is actually going on, and sort of reveal this disparity between the set of like useful things that an ecosystem does and like the price it has. And I think that kind of revealing of a electorate can be actually quite useful. And I actually sort of I compare them in places to something like the wages for housework movement that is also trying to sort of like draw attention to these forms of unvalued activity that are socially useful and significant and like seem like they ought to be valued in some way, and yet they're not, and that is rather than saying this is effort to just like put a price on it, that these are an attempt to instigate a kind of perspectival shift on the status of nature and capitalism and why it is that way, and that I think can prompt these interesting questions like if these things are so useful, why aren't they valued? And if they aren't, then like why do we expect capitalism to value things correctly more broadly? To open up this much bigger question about the nature of capitalist value and how and why things come to have value under capitalism, and to sort of like disabuse of this idea that that like what something is priced at is like what it's worth in some way. So I think they're actually like I think they're fruitful debates, even though I wouldn't endorse sort of sometimes doing a lot of the things that they suggest.
Okay, so the next question is from Malcolm, who says, obviously there's been a lot of good work in this area in the social sciences, much of it coming from a similarly critical view of nature as produced and trying to think through the free or cheap gift. So thinking of people like Jason Moore, Kohei Saito, Bellamy Foster, etc. So what does philosophy specifically have to add to these debates in a disciplinary sense?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think a couple of things. One is that I mean, I think a lot of the work that you named is great, but some of it definitely has tended towards the Marxological. So Saito or Foster have really been focused on what Marx said and what um, trying to find the places where he has like an ecological sensibility, which I think can be helpful and maybe in some ways it's actually quite helpful for people who are working on Marx in a philosophical sense and trying to understand his thought, but doesn't necessarily always help us understand contemporary ecological questions. Sometimes it can, sometimes it doesn't. I think there are points when we want to like say, well, Marx said this, ergo, but I'm not sure that's always like the right way forward. But I do agree that there's been a lot of attention to these questions, and I think in both theory and social science, and I would say this book draws quite a lot on empirical social science, some people working in geography in particular, but in other areas of kind of like critical social sciences of nature, because I do think we need to kind of, I guess, pair like a philosophical or theoretical analysis with attention to what's going on in these like, you know, these different, like kind of, I look at these different sites and, you know, I talked about looking at concrete labor processes, but looking at the forms of these different kinds of natures. I think people like Andrés have done that quite productively in trying to look at how specific qualities of fossil fuels, for instance, you know, enable certain forms of social control within the labor process and within class relations. So, you know, I think, I guess I would say, what does philosophy have to add? I think philosophy has to add a lot, or like philosophy theory, you know, is quite important for putting together also a lot of these different, you know, there are also like a lot of studies of like particular instances of what I'm calling the free gift. I hope that taking a wider angle can help us see how they're like unified and kind of coming out of what I would see as like the same set of social relations and processes, and have again that like broader perspective, and as well as like the kind of more like what is the critical angle, or like what is the angle of critique of capitalism, which I think sometimes is implicit in more empirical work. But you know, I also think, you know, one of the arguments I think of the book is that philosophy and theory also need to be paying attention to, you know, kind of these forms of, you know, what for lack of a better word we could term like empirical social scientific work that's trying to help us, you know, that can help us see how, yeah, these sorts of abstract relations are actually moving through the physical world and can shed light on capitalism as a result, I think. So it's really kind of trying to put different kinds of methodological approaches together in a way.
So I think we have time for one more question. I'll take this one from Time, who says that freedom to me is when you self-restrain, but that's not how we under capitalism see it. Freedom from scarcity is the capitalist notion, which entails a continuous more. So freedom as self-restraint is premised on the notion of subsistence, which means real being, existence. This is how many indigenous people live. So their exploitation of nature is underpinned by self-restraint. So can we revalue freedom to be something like self-restraint?
We could, and some people have certainly tried. I think self-restraint is certainly something we can do with human freedom. I don't know if I would want to define it as fully identical with human freedom. And I do talk a bit in this chapter of the book about what I think is a similar perspective that develops through a lot of ecological, but especially like an ecofeminist thought that says, no, it's not freedom beyond necessity, it's freedom within necessity, and that like restraint and subsistence are crucial kind of orienting features. And people like Maria Mies, who, you know, draws on a kind of subsistence perspective to develop her account of like labor and freedom and things like that. And I find Mies's work very, I've like learned a lot from it. And so it's, you know, and really respect her work a lot, but I also disagree with her on some of these points. And I think some of my worry, is that at least in the versions I've read, and I, you know, I'm sure there are many accounts of this, there can be too much of a, almost inversion where instead of freedom beyond necessity, just necessity itself becomes the site of freedom. And the idea of, there's sort of an acceptance of like the given as the necessary. And again, I think this is something that I want to be skeptical of. Like there are many elements of what we would think of as like nature's limits that maybe don't turn out to be limits. Many of those, that questioning of like the limits of nature, these have been liberatory projects, and I want to hold on to that in that sense of like, you know, again, whether it's in thinking about something like biological reproduction or forms of, you know, what, and I mean, I think about that with the ecofeminists in particular, because sometimes they have a quite strong critique of something like reproductive technology, or, you know, how we're sort of existing in relation to, you know, nitrogen cycles or something, that there might be things that like, where transforming aspects of the natural world as we sort of find it can be a liberatory project, and that it doesn't, like, I'm not sure necessarily what the critique I think we would have to know what is wrong with that in itself, rather than saying it is always wrong, or restraint is the only virtue, and freedom is only achieved through restraint. That said, I think choosing restraint is an expression of freedom and not simply of of unfreedom as it's often framed as being. So I would agree with you on that point, and I think that kind of recognizing that again, that ability to sort of make choices about values and then commit oneself to them is quite vital. So I think there's space for that, absolutely.